All right, it looks like we are now live on Facebook. Um, Hello, everyone who is jumping into our live stream. This is Shelter Force's first Facebook Live appearance. I'm so glad that everyone here could make it. As you all know, we're talking about security deposits today with two very special guests. Alex Williamson, who authored the amazing article back in June on security deposits that kind of spurred this whole conversation, which you can find a link for in the chat. And Steve Harriet, CEO of the Tenancy Deposit Scheme. And I should add that, scheme in the UK has a different connotation in the US. So I know for a lot of us who are tuning in from the US, we may think, oh, scheme, it's like there's a negative connotation, but it's basically just a program. Is that right, Steve? In the
Yeah,
UK?
or service, I guess you'd call it.
Yeah. We want to encourage all of you to, ask questions in the chat below. We want to hear your thoughts, your comments, your questions. Security deposits can be a very major obstacle for many Americans to finding a place to live, right? They're often equal to a month's rent here in the US, which on average is $1,600. And landlords often ask for much higher deposits from renters with lower incomes or credit scores or with past evictions. And while security deposits are supposed to be refundable, it also doesn't help that Forge.com poll of more than 1,000 renters and landlords found that I think 23% of renters believe that a landlord had kept part of their deposit unfairly at some point, and 24% of all landlords admitted that they had absolutely done so. I guess the thing that we wanted to, or that spurred this conversation, right, is that it can be really easy for us to kind of throw our hands up and assume, well, this is, how it's always been, or this is what it's like everywhere. And that's not always the case. So, Steve, could you talk to us a bit about how security deposits are done in the UK?
Yeah, Brandon, first of all, thanks for inviting me on. And hi again to Alex, who, his article I read, and it spurred a conversation between us. So, yeah, let me give you a bit of background to what goes on here in the UK. I'm here, 30 miles south of London, to give you a perspective of where I'm based. But this is unusual because normally people in the UK follow what happens in the States. I think probably we may be slightly ahead of you in this particular area. So what happens in the UK now is that whenever a landlord takes a security deposit from a tenant, it has to be registered in a government authorized service scheme. And I run the biggest one here in the UK. We're a not-for-profit. And what that means is that the landlord has to register it with us. And that does two things. It means it's a guarantee for the tenant that if the landlord unreasonably withholds the deposit at the end of the tenancy, we make sure they get it back. We may actually have the money in our bank account already, because sometimes landlords give us the deposit to hold, or we effectively insure it. And if the deposit isn't paid back, we will pay back the tenant, and then we try and recover the money from the landlord. So the really good thing in the UK is that our 5 million tenancies that we've currently got in the UK, they're all subject to this form of protection for tenants. And the other really good thing, I think, is that if there's a dispute, and hey, there often are disputes, aren't there? Cleaning, rent arrears, damage, whatever it might be, there's going to be a dispute. Now, before 2007, tenants here would have to take the landlord to court, to the county court, to try and get their money back. Never happened. So often landlords would run off with some of the money to which they weren't entitled. So what we now do, in addition to protecting deposits, we have to offer a free and binding alternative dispute resolution service. So we effectively adjudicate on a claim. So if a landlord is asking for £500 back from the deposit, the tenant objects, they can raise a dispute with us. We'll look at the claim. We'll ask the landlord for their evidence as to why they want to make the claim. We'll ask the tenant for their view, and then we'll decide. And each year we're currently dealing with, and these are small numbers in compared to America, but we're dealing with 30,000 disputes a year, free of charge, doesn't cost the tenant anything, doesn't cost the landlord anything. So that's a quick roundup. And I think it started really back in 2007, because before that, we didn't have any of this. We had a situation where deposits were taken, there was no protection, and there was no way in which tenants could get their money back other than going to court. I hope that's a brief summary for you guys about how it works.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting. First of all, thank you, Brandon, and it's good to see you again, Steve. I think it's super interesting that politically you guys were able to get that done, considering just what I know of the landlord lobby here. And, it makes me question what the situation is like on the ground in the UK to have, enough momentum to even get that through.
Yeah, so I guess, to be honest, when it first, was introduced, there was some opposition. I remember actually going in 2013 to Belfast because the scheme was introduced into Northern Ireland in 2013, and I remember standing in front of about 500 landlords who said, this is never going to work, you guys. Tenants will be making claims all the time, the scheme is unworkable, etc., etc. And we had to say to them, look, it does work, we've seen it work elsewhere in the UK. And within a year, the opposition that we faced in Northern Ireland from landlords went away, because actually what we found was that most landlords are actually reasonable people. They're not really trying to rip off their tenants, and they realized quite quickly that if they did try to do that, the tenant could raise a dispute with us and we would investigate it. And our basis is that, look, if the landlord's got a justified claim, we'll agree to it, but we're not going to agree to claims that are not justified. Now, we don't, in the UK, the landlord, there's not really a landlord lobby, because we have, millions of landlords, many of whom are owning one or two properties. We don't have a lot of corporate landlords in the country, but the corporate landlords, interestingly, here, like the scheme, because they felt it took away some of the argument and disagreement that you got. Now, how did we get it off the ground? Well, actually, it got going because we have this organization in the UK called the Citizens Advice Bureau. It's a consumer advocacy group. It's very well known. It's been going for many years. And they started doing surveys of tenants to find out how many of them claimed they weren't getting their deposit back. And it became, to be very high numbers. And they were able to get some traction politically with, in our case, the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrat Party over here. And they managed to tack an amendment onto a housing bill. There was nothing to do with deposits, and it got through. But interestingly, once we got it through in England, it was very easy we have devolved government in the UK. So in Scotland, they looked at the experience in England and thought that this is a good idea, and they introduced it, and the same in Northern Ireland.
Yeah, so it sounds like it's been going well for everyone involved.
Yeah, I mean, there were clearly some, Alex, as there were some landlords that are going to hate this because, they don't really care about their tenants. They just want to maximize the income they can get from them.
Sure.
And there are some of those, and I'm not going to deny that there are not a group of landlords out there that don't like this. They probably evade the legislation. They put pressure on tenants not to raise a complaint. So we have to be real about that. That is bound to be happening, but I guess you have that as well.
Oh, of course, always. Okay, so you mentioned that there were a couple different ways that it plays out. So sometimes you guys will literally hold the deposit, like the full amount. And I assume that's just a matter of like, tenant gives it to you, or no, tenant gives it to landlord, landlord gives it to you. And then there's this other option where you're not literally holding the deposit, but it's sort of insured. So how does that work?
Yeah, so the first one, like you said, all that happens is that the tenant pays the deposit to the landlord, and then they register the deposit with us on our online platform, and they pay us the cash. Now, what we do is we have to hold that cash. We can't speculate with it. We can't go and gamble with it. We can't invest it on the stock exchange. So we actually just invest this in bank deposits. we're not getting much money at the moment because interest rates in the UK are very, very low.
Yeah.
The other model is where if the landlord or the letting agent is seen as a trusted person. So if a letting agent in the UK is a member of a professional trade body, we have this thing called the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors. It's very posh. And we have another organization called Property Mark, which is a letting agent. I think you call them realtors, don't you? A trade body. If they're members of that, they're subject to regulation by those bodies. So what we do is we allow them to keep the deposit in their bank account. They pay a fee to us to pay for the costs of registering the deposit and paying for the cost of our insurance policy. And it also pays for the cost of the free dispute resolution service. And what happens then is that in the relatively rare cases where tenants don't get their money back and they raise a dispute, under the housing legislation, the letting agent is obliged by law to send us the disputed deposit in cash. And I would say 99 times out of 100 they do that, and then we go and look at the case and we distribute the money. In the one case out of 100 where that doesn't happen, what we then are doing is we're trying to pursue the landlord letting agent if necessary through the courts, but if we can't recover the money easily, we'll claim it off our insurance.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting model. I guess if I'm honest, I think the cleanest model is where we simply hold the deposit. It makes a lot more sense, and then we look after that deposit during the tenancy.
Yeah. So it seems like there's this other potential avenue, which I know that we've talked about before with this, where one of the problems with deposits, aside from not getting them back, is that just coming up with it in the first place is hard.
Yeah.
For many tenants, and especially if they still have a deposit that's being held by their former landlord, and now they're supposed to come up with another deposit on top of it. So it's just like a whole lot of money that is locked out and difficult for them to access. But you guys are kind of pioneering a solution or trying to figure out a way to solve that problem.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it's these things are all the same, aren't they? I mean, in the world over. So this, we call it the problem of sort of double deposits. That's the challenge you've got to face. How do you move house when you've got to find another deposit? So interestingly here, and this politically shows the power of the renting lobby. So the Conservative government, Boris Johnson, I think he was in the States quite recently, in his manifesto platform, he introduced a commitment that said that the Conservative government was going to introduce a concept called lifetime deposits. So this is a solution where they're going to try to come up with a way of enabling tenants to move easily where they've got to find another deposit. Now, as ever with politicians, we're not yet there with a complete answer, but I think it's likely to be in some cases a situation where tenants could access a low-cost loan, very low interest, potentially interest-free, for that like 2 or 3 weeks or so when they're leaving one home and they're moving into the next home, and then they get the deposit back. So one of the options that I think we're looking at is the idea of a deposit loan to try and bridge that gap. Interesting, in Australia, deposit protection actually started in Australia. They have in the state of Victoria a tenants bond. So the state government in Victoria actually pays a loan, gives a loan to tenants who then pay it back during the next tenancy. I have tried to suggest to the Prime Minister here through his ministers that a Boris bond would be very popular with tenants. But the point I want to make, Alex, about this in terms of why is a Conservative government here, like a Republican government, why is a Conservative government here interested in this? Because tenants are a very significant now part of the electorate. And in many of the constituencies certainly in England, there's a very significant tenant part of the voting group, who actually in the future are going to start influencing the outcome of elections. And I do think politically, the Conservative government has realised that you need to come up with legislation that supports tenants. And actually, over the last few years, we've had a number of changes. So in 2019, the government banned all fees that tenants had to pay. So in the past, tenants would pay a fee for, getting a property, getting a reference done, paying for an inventory. That's all gone. That was abolished. They also capped deposits. So in the past, there was no cap on deposit. A landlord could charge, 3 months rent, 2 months rent. The cap now in England is 5 weeks rent. That's the maximum deposit. And that's been introduced by a Conservative government. So I think there are votes in this. And, the lifetime deposit idea is definitely something that the government, are working hard on. They're working with us on it. And hopefully there'll be some solutions, coming forward in the next few months that, we can share with you guys.
Yeah.
Right.
That's interesting that renters are like such a political constituency there on the national level. All of our rent laws are completely state by state. And I think just as a country, we're very focused on home ownership as like the one and only route to building wealth. And really it kind of confers rights on you that you don't necessarily have.
I think that's the same here. I mean, I think that, the predominant tenure, has been owner occupation, home ownership.
Right.
But interestingly, we've seen a very significant growth of private renting in the UK over the last 15 years. And actually with COVID, I think that's going to continue because I think people, don't want to be locked into, properties that may be in the wrong place and they're interested in renting. So, yeah, I mean, I think the political dynamic here may be different. And it's certainly something that, we have seen, governments of, Conservative governments paying attention to.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I had one question to you, Steve. But before I ask it, I just wanted to remind all of our viewers to, if you had any questions about anything that our guests are talking about, if you had comments, please feel free to put them in the chat below. This is a Facebook Q&A. But Steve, something that I was really interested in what you spoke on earlier was kind of like when you so when the idea of a kind of lifetime deposit, right? Do you happen to know any of the details on, what would happen if, say, a renter moved from a place where the security deposit would be higher or lower? Would they get that money back, or
yeah, I mean, these are all concepts, I guess, Brandon, that we're still struggling with a bit. So if the idea was you're moving to a cheaper property and the deposit was lower, yeah, you'd get some refund. If you're moving to a more expensive property, you'd need to top up your lifetime deposit. And the idea really is this is a sum of money that over time can move around the system. The problem with it is it needs some sort of guarantee, because the danger is that would a landlord accept somebody coming in to their property without a deposit? So somebody needs to give a guarantee, and that's the thing we're looking at, whether that's a loan guarantee, a short-term insurance guarantee. Is it a guarantee that my sort of scheme could give to the next landlord to enable them to allow the tenant to move in? There's no easy solution to this, and and it's why we've struggled with it, and I guess it's why in the States you're struggling with it. I would love a solution as in the Australian scenario, but I just can't really see that happening in Britain, where we would give a loan to tenants from the government. I can't see that happening in the States either. So it's a tricky one. I mean, we try and encourage landlords here to think about taking deposits in installments. I mean, in a way, the security deposit is only really needed at the end of the tenancy, isn't it? It's there to cover losses at the end. So, if you trust the tenant, why not allow the tenant to pay the deposit in installments over the first, 5 or 6 months of the tenancy? And we do have some landlords that do that. I wish we had a few more that would do it, but I think it's an easy way of getting people into properties.
I think here there's an element of like, well, if you can't afford the whole thing up front, as high as possible, then you're not the kind of renter that I want because you're a riskier renter, So that's kind of the big pushback for installment.
Yeah, and because I think that's the argument, isn't it, that says, you want the tenants to pay the rent, and you want the tenants to have some, financial buffer in case of the claim on the deposit. And I guess from a landlord perspective, one needs to, I guess, understand that, that's what they are concerned about. But equally, we've got to try and make this a bit easier, I think, for tenants to move, because otherwise, what I've been talking about is this anxiety problem. If you're moving, that's stressful enough, because you've got to think about, moving home. You've got to think, if you've got kids, you've got to get them into different schools potentially, and then you've got to find another deposit. We need to try and take this anxiety away and make this a much smoother transaction.
Right. Yeah, we received a question from one of our viewers, and it kind of ties in earlier to how I think I was mentioning on how oftentimes lower income people see higher deposits. And the question is, how can we get around the standard that income has to be about 3 times the amount as rent? Or, yeah. Do either of you have any thoughts on that?
Alex, you have a view?
Go ahead, Steve.
No, you have a view. Yeah, you're bound to have a view locally on this. Yeah.
Not really. Yeah, I don't know. I think that that's a really hard balance. And if housing was truly affordable and pegged to people's incomes, it would make sense. But since it's not, and a lot of people are cost burdened and overextended as it is, it becomes kind of an impossible standard. So my only solution that I could really offer is if there was a sufficient supply of truly affordable housing, then that would be a great, we wouldn't have to do away with that standard. It would just work for whatever your income was.
I mean, I think, what's happened over here, of course, is that we've capped the deposit. So, if you're a low income household, you can't be asked to supply, 3 months deposit. That's just not allowed. So, 5 weeks rent is still quite a lot, but I think landlords are always concerned over here that tenants towards the end of the tenancy don't pay the last month's rent, and then they disappear. So I think landlords here are quite attracted to the idea of allowing at least 4 or 5 weeks rent deposit. But my view at the bottom end of the market here, in terms of very low income households where they can't afford the deposit needs to be replaced by something else. We're working with some local councils, municipalities over here to talk to them about whether they can help provide a deposit guarantee to tenants who have low income. Because if you're on very low income, you're not going to find that $1,600 that you spoke about, are you, for a deposit? It's not going to happen. And councils over here are quite supportive of that, and we're getting some traction. We're calling this thing a fair bond. And we're trying to get councils to help support people moving into the private rented sector with the benefit of this deposit bond that they're backing, and we're administering it. It's only a solution, I think, at certain parts of the market, but it replaces, I think in the States I've seen that, you have charities, don't you, that support people into housing, and I know credit unions are quite active in some areas. It's a sort of microcosm of this market, that certainly in the UK is quite broad. We have very poor people in private housing, and very rich people renting.
Something that I don't think we've touched on that I think is interesting about how the UK does deposits is, once this was kind of instated, I imagine that it had an impact on landlord behavior, and just sort of, so it's not just that there's a better mechanism for tenants to get it back if it's wrongfully withheld, but also just the problem isn't really coming up in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, Alex, that the biggest thing that I think changed, and I don't know what happens in the States, but our dispute process says that it's the landlord to prove a deduction from the deposit, and they have to provide evidence to back it up. So what we saw in the early days is that often landlords hadn't done an inventory at the start of the tenancy, and hadn't done a sort of inspection report at the end. So they couldn't actually show there'd been any damage caused because they had no evidence really to support it. So we started rejecting those claims quite quickly. And then I would say, within a year, most landlords now do a check-in report. They do an inventory. They share it with the tenant to make sure the tenant's happy with it. And at the end of the tenancy, they'll do a checkout report and again share that with the tenant. And if they don't do that, they now know in the UK they're not going to get a successful claim against the deposit. And I think that's the biggest change I've seen. It's made the playing field a bit more level, because in the old days, the tenant would say, well, that wardrobe, that cabinet was already damaged when I moved in, and the landlord said no, it wasn't. And then how do you prove it?
Right.
So that's been the biggest change. And I'm not sure what happens in the States, but it has made, I think, we don't now see very many frivolous claims coming through from landlords. We don't see them.
Yeah. Well, sorry, Brandon, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna, we had another question from the audience. Someone asked if there was anywhere in the US that is doing anything similar to the tenancy deposit scheme.
No.
No? Okay.
There is not. This appears to be a UK thing and also an Australian thing, I just learned.
Yeah.
But,
we're quite keen to talk to US states about this, because we think the model is actually easily transferable. We need to get a bit of traction. I mean, the other thing we haven't spoken about, Alex, is the rise of these deposit replacement insurance products, which I think you've got in the States as well, and we're starting to see them here.
Yeah.
And I guess I've read some of your articles about this, so it's for me, the situation is similar. That what we're seeing is some of these insurance companies coming to the market and saying to tenants, look, rather than pay a cash deposit, take out an insurance policy that effectively protects the landlord in the event of a claim. That's the same thing, isn't it, that's happening in the States, Alex?
Yeah, there's been a pretty substantial movement. It's some would call it an AstroTurf movement of these deposit alternative providers trying to basically legalize their product or force landlords to accept their product. And the way that the product works is tenants will pay these fees usually on a monthly basis, and that will all be non-refundable. And then at the end of their lease, sometimes even in the middle of their lease, their landlord can make a claim for any damage or unpaid rent, anything like that. And then the tenant will still be liable for that on top of their fees.
Right.
And a big problem with those products is that tenants entering into those agreements don't always realize that's how it works, because there's one company in particular that describes it as insurance, and that's not really how people think of insurance as working. So they're shocked to receive this big bill, sometimes for thousands of dollars, and to be out those fees on top of it. So
so that's exactly the same, I think, as the situation here, because technically we call this a surety bond. Is that the same expression you have, rather than insurance product? Yeah,
exactly.
And you're absolutely right, because I think if you take an insurance product and let's say you crash the car, you might pay an excess on the claim, but the insurance company will pay the damage. With these deposit replacement products, it's different, isn't it? I mean, essentially you're still liable as a tenant for whatever damage that the insurance company might end up paying to the landlord.
It's only insurance in the most technical sense of the word, and that's kind of how they get away with it.
I mean, I think the thing that I've been particularly concerned about, having read of your experience, and it's something that I'm alert to, is that often tenants will have a 5 or 6 week deposit. They'll cash it in, I think in your scenario, Alex, and then they find that the surety bond that the landlord now has is for 12 weeks worth of rent.
That's right.
So essentially that they've given up their $1,600 worth of deposit, and they've got that, but now they're liable for $4,000 or $5,000 of damage, and I'm not sure that that's very clear to tenants. And I guess that, in terms of mis-selling of a product, that's, I would say, is one of the biggest risks of this, that people don't really understand what it is they're buying.
Right. And I think it's particularly concerning because these products, they're not like, if we have a constraint, and I don't know if this is the same in the UK, but we have like a state by state constraint on how high deposits can be, but there's no constraint on how big of a bond you can sell a renter. And if they don't read that contract, they have no idea what they're signing up for, and how much they'll actually be liable down the road for.
Yeah, so we have a slight benefit here that, you know, if it's, you know, seen as an insurance type product, it's a regulated product here. So there is a regulator that looks at these things. And actually the thing the regulator over here is most concerned about is mis-selling. We've not had, you know, a lot of take up yet of these products in the UK, but I think the people that are responsible operators in this area, you know, are very, very, you know, keen to focus on making sure that products aren't missold, but also making sure that the deposit values are not, you know, very large, because, you know, it seems bizarre to be, you know, a tenant to have a deposit of 4 or 5 weeks rent and then suddenly find that they're liable for 12 weeks. And you know, I think in the UK, if that were to happen on a wide scale basis, I suspect that people would call foul, because you've got a statutory limit on deposits of 5 weeks rent. You know, if you're going to have an equal playing field here, you need to make sure these products don't, you know, go significantly above that.
Right. Makes sense to me.
If I could cut in, we had one last question before we ended the Facebook Live. But we had a viewer ask: is there in the UK, is there assistance in the courts for tenants? Do judges help tenants understand the law or refer them to legal aids? Are there mediators in the adjudication in the courtrooms to support tenants?
Yes, that's an interesting question. And so the first point is deposit disputes. They nearly all get dealt with through my service and other services that don't go to court. So, and that's a great benefit actually, because ours is a free service. You know, we assume that the tenant's entitled to their money, and we have the landlord prove it. So in the strict area of deposit disputes, I think we have a pretty good alternative to courts, and I think we are there to make sure that, you know, tenants, you know, are protected. The wider question of other action in court, so if tenants are going, you know, to defend evictions, or you know, they're trying to take the landlord to court, or the landlord is taking them to court, I think it's a tricky picture, because access to the courts here, particularly in England and Wales, there is limited ability for, you know, tenants to get representation. There's a growing movement here about looking at the value of mediation, and we are involved in some of these sort of mediation projects. But, you know, I think one of the great successes of what we've achieved here in TDS is we've dealt with 150,000, you know, tenancy deposit disputes, none of which went to court, and none of which cost the tenant any money, didn't cost the landlord any money to do it. The court system, I think, is the same in the States, is increasingly expensive here to access. And I think everyone would admit that in a situation where landlords have legal representation at court and tenants don't, there's an immediate power imbalance there, which I think we all know is a problem.
Right.
Unfortunately, that's also what we face over in the US, where that is a common practice. But Steve, Alex, I really appreciate you two coming on and just explaining the issue to all of our Shelter Force readers. This was a really informative talk, and I really enjoyed it. I got a lot of you know, new insight on this. I was wondering if either of you had any you know, final words for our audience members on this topic.
Well, I would just say, first of all, thanks so much for including me in this discussion. It was really wonderful to hear from Steve. I think that this is a really kind of exciting idea. I can't believe I hadn't heard of it until Steve reached out to me. And I don't know what the movement would look like for exploring this in the States, but I think it would be worthwhile.
And for me, Brandon, I'm really keen to see whether there is any interest in somewhere in the US, in a city or a state that's interested in looking at this, because I think the model is eminently transferable. What we do here, I'm sure, would work in the US. We just need to find, some politicians who are interested in trying this, and if you find them, I think we can fly to the States now, can't we? I think we're allowed to come in. So
yeah,
we'll be there, we'll come and talk to you. And actually, if anybody wants more information, we got, look at our website. It's www.tenancydepositscheme.com. A lot of information there. And I'm happy, if people want to reach out to me via yourselves, we're happy to help.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Well, once again, thank you for coming on to our Facebook Live. For all of our viewers, please remember to follow us on Facebook, on Twitter. Check out our website, shelterforce.org. And we hope to do more events like this in the future. So hope to see you again soon.
Great.
All right.
All right.
Bye
Thank
now.
you. Bye. Good to see you.
Bye.
Bye now.